Hello, I'm Andrew Pritchard, and thank you for watching today's Corn Belt Regional Forecast, brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. So we talk about your 3 bullet points here for the Corn Belt going into next week. We've got active Dakotas and Upper Midwest. This will continue to be the corridor that we see the most frequent thunderstorm activity heading into next week. Again, the Dakotas into the Upper Midwest remaining active. Tropical Storm Barry, that is our big wild card. We'll have to talk about the latest with the track there. And then after that, the heat is certainly on. It does look like after the passage of Barry, the ridge resumes, the ridge strengthens over the central U.S., and that means a return of some summer heat across the central and the eastern Corn Belt. The snapshot view here, your week 1 and week 2 precipitation forecast. Here is your active corridor here across the northern plains into the upper Midwest. Here is the obvious wild card Barry, keeping things dry then across the central and eastern Corn Belt overall. Looking at the week 2 forecast, not quite as defined, still holding on certainly to the northern plains and the Great Lakes being more active, but not quite such a dry signal across the eastern Corn Belt. And we'll talk about why that may be and why we may see a return of thunderstorms to that area as we head into the week 2 time period. Your temperature forecast over the next 10 days, obviously seeing the impacts from Barry here in the form of some cooler anomalies over the next 5 days, but hot across the northern plains into the Great Lakes, warmer than average. And then as we look at July 18th through the 22nd, seeing heat resume across the central U.S. into the eastern Corn Belt, essentially the entire Corn Belt, going to be dealing with some heat as we get into the end of next week. The last 24 hours of precipitation has been very dry across a big chunk of the Corn Belt, and we look at the last 14 days overall, you can really see where the active period or where the active region has been here across the northern plains into the upper Midwest. We're going to be talking a lot about the eastern Corn Belt now and what overall has been a drier pattern. But this area here going to be looking to get quite a bit of rain, maybe a little bit further south than that. We'll talk about the forecast track here, but honing in on this area of the eastern Corn Belt into the mid-south that overall has been drier for the last 2 weeks. Now, I know that there are some people who saw local impacts from some of these clusters of thunderstorms within the last 2 weeks, and there are still some areas that have some standing water in the fields, but overall, the eastern Corn Belt has been dry for the last 2 weeks, or drier overall. A satellite picture as we wake up on Friday morning, infrared satellite picture, so we're looking at the very cold cloud tops of some of these clouds across the Corn Belt. Looking at a cluster of dying thunderstorms across South Dakota, another cluster of dying thunderstorms now across northern Minnesota into the UP of Michigan. But overall, looking at another sunny and warm day across a big chunk of the Corn Belt. And now here is our wild card off to the south. This is Barry down here, a very disorganized system, but you can make out a very slow counterclockwise cyclonic flow within that storm system. But again, this one was never expected to really rapidly intensify into a major hurricane. It's been a flooding issue that we need to monitor. So disorganized, but it is down there. We'll take a look at the high-resolution NAM model precipitation forecast, and that's really going to highlight the pattern that I just kind of broadly laid out for you, with things remaining active across the Dakotas into the upper Midwest, and then with Barry making its way up the Mississippi River Valley. So we'll go ahead and we'll take my drawings off. I'll step through time with you on this one as we head through the weekend. Let's go ahead and we'll get it playing one more time. Let me pause and bring it back here to Friday morning. We head through the day on Friday. We're watching this area of thunderstorms die out across South Dakota. We may eventually see that perhaps re-strengthen across parts of maybe eastern South Dakota, parts of southern Minnesota. Also watching for the possibility of thunderstorm clusters redeveloping here in northern Wisconsin, and then watching for isolated thunderstorms here across the rest of the Dakotas as we head into Friday evening and the overnight. As we head into the day on Saturday, again, watching this same corridor for the potential for one or more MCSs, one or more clusters of thunderstorms as we head through the remainder of the weekend and we get into Sunday, seeing the same thing. This pattern lighting up from the Dakotas into the upper Midwest. And now here comes Barry making its way up through the Mississippi River Valley. Now the NAM is not always the best at handling tropical systems here, so we're not going to put too much detail or focus on too much detail here, but we can see it's making its way northward along the Mississippi River. As we look at the total precipitation forecast through 2 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, again, we can really see the active area here from the Dakotas into the upper Midwest. We see some thunderstorms potentially developing here along a frontal boundary during the day on Sunday, but I wouldn't put too much stock into that. I wouldn't get too excited if you're looking for rainfall in that area, because that's along a kind of a weak frontal boundary that's making its way through the area. And I can go ahead and I'll show you what I'm talking about. As we loop our temperatures through the weekend here, again, using the high-resolution NAM model, we'll get into late in the day on Saturday, and then on Sunday, here you see this kind of front laid out right in this area. And that's where perhaps we'll see an isolated thunderstorm or two develop, but likely going to be some pretty strong capping in that area. That a cap is a layer of warm air just above the surface that kind of acts to suppress thunderstorms in the lower levels of the atmosphere. And so, again, really going to be focusing on the Dakotas into the upper Midwest for our thunderstorm activity. You can see that front again when we look at the forecast instability over the next 2.5 days. I'll go ahead and play this out through late Saturday. There you see that front kind of sagging in through parts of northern Illinois and Indiana, eating away at some of the instability in the area. So again, a very low chance of a thunderstorm in this area as we head through parts of the weekend, but really going to be focusing on the Dakotas into the upper Midwest over the next 60 hours or so. The next 3 days of severe weather outlooks from the Storm Prediction Center on Friday. Down here up here in the top left, we got the marginal risk from the Dakotas into parts of the Great Lakes. Saturday over here on the right there, the severe weather risk very low on Saturday, confined to western portions of the Dakotas. And then Sunday over here in the bottom, we've got a slight risk across Montana with that marginal risk expanding across parts of North Dakota into northern Minnesota. Taking a look at Barry now, here is the latest from the National Hurricane Center with that track, and we have seen consensus here with an eastward turn near the Ohio River. Now, whether it does that, north of the Ohio River or a little bit closer to the Ohio River, that's going to be needed to sort out. But these are the experts when we talk about hurricane and tropical system forecasting in the United States, and this is what they've got right now. Also keeping this as a tropical storm. There had been some talk about maybe this strengthening into a weak hurricane. I showed you the satellite picture, though it remains a very disorganized system, and as of now, maintaining tropical storm strength as it makes its way onto land here in the coast of Louisiana as we get into the early part of the day on Saturdays when we expect this landfall. Making its way slowly north and then curving off to the northeast as we get into early next week. So this would be an impact as we get into the Corn Belt, the eastern Corn Belt, the Ohio River Valley, and the Mid-South. Talking about early next week, getting into certainly late Monday, but more likely Tuesday and Wednesday. So we'll be talking about the impacts here in the Corn Belt. The latest from the European Ensemble forecast. Now, each one of these little tracks you see is an individual member of the European long-range model and its forecast track of the center of the circulation of Barry. And we have seen a general trend going this direction. Earlier forecasts had this thing perhaps making more of a northward journey before it hooks off to the east, tracking more through central Illinois and central and northern Indiana. But the trend has definitely been a more eastward track, and where we're seeing, the thicker clustering of these ensemble forecasts is definitely closer to the Ohio River. As we loop out the European long-range model, the precipitation forecast, taking it into early next week, you can see the same thing. Certainly notice the active period here across the Dakotas into the upper Midwest. I don't mean to not be talking about that, because otherwise this would be the active area across the Corn Belt with this ridge remaining dry across the central and the eastern Corn Belt otherwise. If it were not for Barry. So I don't mean to leave you guys out. Certainly pay attention there. It's just that these clusters of thunderstorms, they're hard to pin down with any kind of specific nature. So it doesn't do me any good to really tell you that Sunday night at 7 p.m. you're getting a thunderstorm cluster here across the Dakotas. Just notice the active pattern overall. As we head through the weekend and into early next week, it doesn't shut down across the Dakotas and the upper Midwest. That is our active area. It's just that we need to talk about the updates here because this is a significant wild card with Barry. And again, what should be a very dry pattern across the eastern Corn Belt, and it's not going to be that way just because of Barry. The latest precipitation forecast from the European long-range model, again, highlighting the track, the journey northward along the Mississippi River. Now, this is obviously bad news down there for those folks for a number of reasons, the biggest of which is they're still dealing with a lot of floodwaters in the Mississippi River down in the lower portions there, largely as a result of what happened up here. The floodwaters from the Midwest funneling their way down the Mississippi River, and so they're at very high levels already as we talk about the Gulf Coast, parts of Louisiana, and then the lower Mississippi Valley. And so with all of this rain falling over there, this has the potential to be a pretty bad situation along the Mississippi River as it makes its journey northward. And then we see that curve off to the east, and then, of course, the northern edge of the precipitation on this kind of thing can be very difficult to pin down. Right now, the European model taking the northern edge here in parts of Illinois, kind of along and south of Interstate 70, tracking into parts of central Indiana, and then a big chunk of Ohio, potentially seeing some precipitation from this. Now, if I compare this with the GFS, the European on the left, GFS over here on the right. Very similar look, but the GFS is even a little bit further east and south. You look at the northern edge of the precipitation here with the GFS, and it kind of hugs the Ohio River. So, if you're familiar with this area, I can kind of throw out some landmarks here right now. The European keeping it along and south of Interstate 70, and then the GFS keeping the heavier rainfall along and south of the Ohio River. Now again, not leaving out the Dakotas and the upper Midwest, notice both models agree here that the more active corridor in terms of thunderstorm activity remains from the Dakotas into Minnesota and Wisconsin on both models here in what otherwise would be a dry pattern across this area. But here's the latest, and that is what it is. As we get close here, I told you the impact in the Corn Belt doesn't happen until late Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So Eric will certainly have a great update for us early on Monday morning, and we'll be able to kind of focus in on the more specifics with the impact here across the Corn Belt. Now beyond that, we take a look at the long-range European model, the forecast with the jet stream here. You see Barry make its way through. I'll kind of point that out one more time. Here comes Barry, but then watch what happens when it gets out of here. You see the ridge really strengthen back up as we get into the July 18th, 19th, and beyond that time period. So with the re-strengthening of the ridge, your thunderstorm activity is going to remain active here across the Dakotas and the upper Midwest, but this is a strengthening of what is a hot and a dry pattern from the Central Plains into the Eastern Corn Belt. So again, Barry gets out of here during the middle part of next week. As we get into late next week, into next weekend, so again, talking about, around July 18th and beyond, it does look like the heat returns across the Corn Belt. And we can see that with the temperature anomaly forecast over the same time period. You see some impacts from Barry there with some cooler anomalies down in this region as the loop starts. But as we get to the middle part there, you see the heat really kicking back on across the Central Plains, the Midwest, and the Eastern Corn Belt. So we look at the precipitation forecast. It's going to show you the two active corridors. Again, remember the Northern Plains and the upper Midwest. And then here is the impact from Barry making its way northward. And then here is your drier region from the Central Plains into the Eastern Corn Belt. And remember, this would be, drier expanding all the way down into this area if it were not for Barry making its way in. So as we look at the next 10 days or so, it's the Northern Plains into the upper Midwest, and it's the Barry impact here from parts of the lower Mississippi Valley into the Mid-South and the Ohio River Valley. We'll take a look at what happens as we get even further out here towards the end of the month of July. Just kind of teasing, I mentioned that perhaps as we talk about week 2, not such a dry signal across the Eastern Corn Belt. And you see the ridge build in here as we get into the middle part of the loop. There it is, strengthening. But then look what happens as we get towards the end. I'm going to go ahead and we'll just click through time so you can see what happens. We'll get through here. Here comes Barry. We get into around, next weekend, so we're talking about around the 18th through the 22nd of July, dealing with some big heat as this ridge really builds across the middle part of the country. Here's the active area here along the better upper level jet stream support. But in this area, this is a resumption of a hot and dry pattern across the Central Plains into the Eastern Corn Belt. Now, what happens as we get beyond, say, the week 2 time period, getting into the last 10 days or so of July, you see the ridge begin to migrate off towards the west. Now, if this happens, if we do see the ridge migrating out here towards the Rockies from, say, Montana down into Mexico, we're getting trajectories like this from the jet stream now across the Eastern Corn Belt. And this brings in the potential for northwest flow, potentially getting these ridge-riding thunderstorms then tracking from the Dakotas back into the Eastern Corn Belt, getting those clusters of thunderstorms, those MCSs tracking into parts of the Eastern Corn Belt. Now, this is way out there in what's normally a short range, 5 to 7 day update. But I just want to let you know, as you look at the next, 10 to 15 days, we're in a hotter, drier pattern over the Eastern Corn Belt. We get the impacts from Barry. Beyond Barry, we resume that hot and dry period, but it's not set in stone that this is going to be lingering for the rest of the summer. If this ridge really is going to begin migrating off towards the west as we get into the later part of July, into the week 2 time period, we could see things pick back up here across the Eastern Corn Belt. And again, Eric will talk about this more in his long-range forecasts. We'll finish up here with the 5-day temperature forecast, the 5-day high temperature forecast. As we look at your Friday highs, warmest in the Central Plains, where we're in the 90s. Still enjoying some milder weather in the Eastern Corn Belt and some drier weather, less humid is what I mean there, in addition to less precipitation. But here in Central Illinois, after dealing with dew points in the upper 70s, we've now got dew points in the lower 60s. So even though you see the mid to upper 80s there, it's a dry heat, as they like to say. Saturday, warming back up in a big way across much of the Corn Belt, back in the 90s, widespread upper 90s across the Central Plains here and the Northern Plains. For your Sunday high temperatures, here comes the impact from Barrie now as we get into early next week. Your Monday high temperatures, and then finishing with Tuesday. As always, Eric Snodgrass will have an in-depth look at the evolution of the next 1 to 2 weeks in our Monday morning Ag Forecast video, and I'll have your next Corn Belt regional update for you right here on Tuesday. Have a wonderful day and a great weekend.